So the pictures that you see on the screen and on your notes, these are all types of cells that we're going to see over the next couple weeks. And what you see in these pictures are some cells. So for example, in this picture, these are some animal cells, a bunch of them. Here you have some cells from a plant. Here you see some more, all stacked on top of each other. Here are some others. Here are some others. So each thing that I'm kind of outlining, those are individual cells that are composing a living thing. Inside of each cell is one of the organelles we're going to talk about today. Cells inside of them are these small parts that have a job to do. That's the nucleus of those cells. And we'll talk about what that means today. Now, so just to sort of give the overview, cells are what we call the basic unit of life. Everything that is alive is made of cells. So we say that cells are the building blocks or the basic units of life. And they're found in all living things. If something is alive, it's made of cells. It really wasn't until the 1600s when scientists first started to really study cells and be able to understand them. Do you know why? Why did it take until the 1600s before scientists really started to study cells?
Maybe they didn't have the technology?
You're exactly right. What specifically did they not have?
A microscope?
Yeah, there were no microscopes. Okay? Grinding lenses, which is what's in a microscope that magnifies the image, that didn't really become common until the middle of the 1600s. Okay? And so once scientists started to make lenses that could magnify an image, that's when they started to be able to see these things that are smaller than you could see with the naked eye. One of the first scientists to do this was Robert Hooke. He was who we think of as the first scientist to observe cells. He was using a microscope, and he was looking at a small section of something like this. You know what this is? This is cork. You can pass it around. Where does cork come from? It's the bark of a certain type of tree. It's wood. It is made of material that was once living. And Hooke made a thin section of cork, looked at it in his microscope, and saw something like this. This is one of the drawings from his research. Okay? And what you see is there's all these little sections, all these little boxes that make up this cork. So he did this in 1665. He made his drawings. But what I'm passing around, that cork, it's actually not alive right now. And the cells that Hooke saw were not alive. But he is the person that gave them the name cells. What he thought is these little boxes looked like the little rooms that monks slept in a monastery that were called cells. So he called these cells. Gave cells their name. Now at this time, scientists were creating better and better microscopes, making better lenses that could give greater magnification. And one of the scientists that really mastered the ability to make lenses was Anton Van Leeuwenhoek. He was the first scientist that we think of as seeing living cells. Now his microscopes were sort of strange looking. These are the microscopes he made. What they were was a tiny little lens, like a sphere of glass, And he came up with this way of making these lenses that allowed them to give really good magnification. He was very secretive. He wouldn't tell anybody how he made these lenses. Okay? But he was able to make them. And he looked at living cells. What he looked at were a bunch of things in 1675. He looked at water from a pond, and he saw that in that water, there's actually living organisms that you could only see in the microscope. He looked at blood, and noticed it's not just like a red liquid, it's actually a clear sort of liquid with these red cells kind of floating along in it. He looked at sperm and saw that the sperm cells were these individual living cells that were moving around. And so these are all cells that are actually alive. And these are cells you couldn't see without a microscope.
Wait, how? No. That's wrong.
So this is Leeuwenhoek, often known as the world's first microbiologist. A microbiologist is a scientist that studies living things that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. This is what his microscopes actually look like. It's sort of a weird thing, right? That doesn't really look probably like a microscope to you. The way these microscopes worked, there's a tiny little lens here, a roundish lens mounted in that metal. You put your sample on this little pin, and then you'd hold it up to the light to look through it. You could adjust the focus and move the things up and down using these knobs. Okay. Today is Anton Van Leeuwenhoek's birthday. October 24th, 1632 is when he was born. And last year on his birthday, you know how Google, they changed like the Google? Last year, Google made on this day, last year, they made Anton Van Leeuwenhoek the Google Doodle thing. And here you see him. This is one of his microscopes. Okay? And so that was kind of neat. So Leeuwenhoek and Hook and other scientists started to build up our knowledge about cells. And today we have this overall concept of cells called the cell theory. And it has 3 parts that you have to know. 3 statements that go along with it. So cell theory says, first of all life is made up of 1 or more cells. Anything that is alive. The second part says that cells are the smallest form of life. There are some organisms which are just one single cell. And the third part has to do with where cells come from. Can you guess the answer to that? Where do cells come from?
Bacteria.
Well, they can, but where do our cells come from?
Our body.
Other cells. Cells come from other cells. Cells can reproduce, making new cells. So we call these concepts kind of put together the cell theory. And what we're going to be talking about for the rest of today is about some more specifics. Now, we are a living thing, right?
Yep.
But in us, we have a heart, a brain, lungs, kidneys. What do we call those parts? Organs. They're things within us that our body uses to stay alive. They each have sort of a job to do. You know, our kidneys filter our blood. Our lungs take in oxygen. Our heart moves blood around our body. So those organs have a job to do to help keep us alive. Well, in a cell, there are similar sort of things. Inside this tiny little cell, there are parts we call organelles. And these organelles, there's a bunch of different ones we'll learn about. They each have a certain job to do, a function.
Whoa.
And what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day are what these organelles are, what their function is, what do they do. So when we do this, we're going to talk about these organelles, and when we look at cells, we kind of, for our purposes, split them into two categories, plant cells and animal cells. Now there are other types of cells. There are cells of bacteria and fungi and protists and so forth. For now, we're just going to basically talk just about plant and animal cells. So one of these cells on your paper is a plant cell, one is an animal cell. Maybe we want to take a guess as to which is which. I know you guys told me earlier you haven't really studied cells before. Luke, what do you think?
The one like on the left side is a plant cell.
Why do you say that?
Um,
You're right. Is there something that led you to think that's a plant cell?
I don't know.
Brianna?
In the beginning, you said like in the pictures, the cells were all flat, like square and stacked up,
Oh,
and you said they were fractal.
yeah. In the very beginning, when I showed you the slides on the very first slide, I said the plant cells were all stacked up. Yeah. So plant cells are often kind of rectangular in shape, where they have like sort of corners to them or angles. Whereas animal cells are usually more rounded, sort of irregular, kind of blob shaped. So some of the organelles we talk about are only found in plant cells. They're not found in animal cells. And I'll point those out to you. So the first is the cell wall, which is shown right here. It's a dark green outer edge of this plant cell. It's thick. And it's only in plant cells. So be sure to write that down. I mean, other like bacteria, fungi, they do have a cell wall too, but we're not really getting into those right now. And this cell wall is made of this material called cellulose. Cellulose is like a non-living, durable, strong material. This piece of cork that I passed around, what you're holding on to is the leftover cellulose from millions of plant cells. Cellulose is what makes up wood, and the bulk of like lettuce is mostly cellulose. Okay. And it's on the outside of the plant cell. And it helps to support the plant cell and protect it. But it's really sort of non-living. It's kind of just like a shell that's around the living parts of the cell. Everything inside is living and moving and alive, but that outer shell is not. So if you look at the animal cell, it doesn't have that hard, thick outer shell. It has a more flexible outer boundary. That's called the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is this outer edge of the animal cell, but it is also in the plant cell. It's hard to see because it's like just inside of the cell wall. There's a thin layer on the outside. That's the cell membrane. It is alive. cell membrane is really important. Because the cell membrane regulates what moves in and out of the cell. It's also important for cells communicating with each other. So then within the cell, what you see in light green here, or blue here, sort of the stuff that fills up the cell is called cytoplasm. Did you ever have like that dessert when it's like Jell-O with chunks of fruit stuck in it?
Yeah.
So if you imagine like that's like a cell, like the Jell-O part would be like the cytoplasm, and all the chunks of fruit sort of stuck in there would be like the organelles, the other parts. Kind of holds everything in place. It also allows material to move around in the cell. It's found in all cells, plant, animal. So if I look at this, this is an actual photograph from a compound microscope. I see two cells. First of all, raise your hand if you can tell me, are these plant cells or animal cells? Grace? They're animal cells. We know they don't have a thick outer layer. There's no cell wall. They're kind of roundish in shape. All right, what's this outermost layer, this dark blue? What organelle is that? Ethan?
Cell membrane?
It's a cell membrane. This stuff that's in white, that's filling up most of the rest of the cell, Grace? That's the cytoplasm. This dark area we'll get to talk about next. That's the nucleus. Nucleus is an important organelle within a cell. It's pretty large usually. If I look back here, this is the nucleus. This is the nucleus here. It's pretty large, and we sometimes think about it like the control center of the cell. Because there's something very, very important that's inside of the nucleus. Inside of the nucleus of your cells is the information that makes you who you are. What do we call that? What molecule is that? Brianna?
DNA.
Yeah, it's your DNA. Our DNA is in our nucleus of all of our cells. And that's why it's so important. Now it has sort of an outer layer. Okay. It's called the nuclear membrane that separates the nucleus from the rest of the cell. And the nuclear membrane keeps the DNA inside the cell, but allows other things to go out of the cell. Just like sort of the cell membrane does with the cell. Nuclear membrane allows things in and out and regulates how they move in and out. Also inside of the nucleus are these, they look like X's here. These are the chromosomes. What are chromosomes? You know what they are? John?
Is it something about a gender?
Your gender is determined by the chromosomes that you have, yes. What else can you say about the chromosomes? Ethan?
Usually 23 of them.
You have 23 pair, or 46 total. They contain your genetic information. That's your DNA, is in these things we call chromosomes. So we have 46 chromosomes normally. 23 of them you inherited from your mother, and 23 of those chromosomes you inherited from your father. Sometimes they look like X's, like this. Other times they unwind, and they're like an unwound ball of string. It depends when you're looking at the cell. And then there's one last part within the nucleus. It's called the nucleolus. Sounds like nucleus, but nucleolus. And the nucleolus, it means little nucleus. It's a part in the nucleus that makes an organelle called the ribosome, which we're about to talk about. So all these things in the box are really a part of the nucleus. When you looked at that first slide that Rhiannon just talked about, when I was showing you the different types of cells through the microscope, all those little dots that you saw in each cell was the nucleus of those cells. Here's a big word for you. You can impress your parents when you tell them what you learned today. The endoplasmic reticulum. Often we abbreviate that as ER, endoplasmic reticulum. It's this series of kind of tubes that runs through the cell. And the job of the ER is to transport things, to make substances and transport them from place to place. There's two types of ER, called the rough ER, which has all these dots on it, and then the smooth ER, which does not have those dots. And they're located in different parts of the cell. And the reason the rough ER looks like that with all these dots, those dots are actually this next organelle, the ribosome. Ribosome's job is to make protein. Protein is very, very important in cells, in all living things. It's the key thing that makes up our bodies is protein. To help remember it, what I sometimes tell students, what are the first three letters of this? Rib. You don't like ribs, like to eat ribs? What are ribs are a type of what? Meat, and meat is mainly protein. So if you come out, ribs go with protein, the ribosome makes protein. That's its job. Some of the ribosomes are stuck to the ER like this. Others are just kind of floating around in the cytoplasm on their own. Oh, the other hint I give sometimes, ER, endoplasmic reticulum. If you get hurt, you have to be transported to the ER, emergency room. If you can remember that little phrase, the ER's job is to transport things in the cell. Golgi bodies, sometimes called Golgi apparatus. Anybody, probably not you, maybe your parents, listen to the band Fish?
The what? I didn't know.
No, nothing.
Wait, was a video?
There's a band, one of their songs is Golgi apparatus, but don't worry about it. Well, you can listen, find it online.
How old is it?
They're still playing. Yeah. The Golgi body's job is to take material that the cell is going to release, package it up, and send it out of the cell. We sometimes compare it to like a post office where you would go put something in a box and mail it to somewhere else. Kind of like the Golgi bodies. They package up things to be sent out. What happens is the rough ER and the ribosomes together make the proteins, send them off to the Golgi bodies, which package them up into these little bubbles, which then leave the cell. I say they kind of look like a stack of pancakes with delicious drops of pure maple syrup right next to them. Maybe that's just because lunch is coming up and I'm hungry.
We have a creative imagination.
Maybe. Vacuoles. Vacuoles are storage areas for the cell. Cells sometimes need to store up water or food or waste. And the place that they put it is in these things we call vacuoles. In plants, there's a really large vacuole in the middle of the cell usually. In animal cells, they're usually smaller. Here's a picture of a plant and an animal cell. Which is the plant cell? Robert?
The one on that one?
Which one, right or left?
The right one.
Yes, this is a plant cell. We know it's got a thick cell wall. It's kind of rectangular shape. Inside of the plant cell, this grayish part, it's a little hard to see. That's a huge vacuole in the middle of the cell. The plant cells are just small. Here's another picture. This is from an electron microscope. So we see in this cell, this is a plant cell, the whole thing. All of this gray area is the vacuole, filled up with water. Lysosomes are small sacs filled with digestive enzymes that can break things down in the cell. They just look like really small little circles in there. Then we have our last two organelles, two really important ones. They're both related to energy. They're the mitochondria and the chloroplast. Mitochondria looks like a jelly bean with a bunch of folds inside of it. And the job of the mitochondria is to supply the cell with energy. The mitochondria takes in sugar, breaks it down, and then releases its energy so the cell can use it. That's a really important process. Sometimes it's called the powerhouse of the cell because it supplies energy, or the mighty mitochondria. And the process that does that, we're going to be learning a lot about at the end of this unit, but it's called respiration, or cellular respiration. Is the process which releases that energy. That's what happens in the mitochondria. The last organelle is the chloroplast. Chloroplast is found in plants only, and it's the organelle that allows plants to make their own food. Chloroplasts are the green structures in leaves and stems that make plants green. They contain this pigment called chlorophyll, a green pigment. This basil plant, in its leaves, the cells that make up the leaves of this basil plant have lots of chloroplasts in them. And when the sun shines on the leaves of this plant, the chloroplasts capture sunlight, use water and carbon dioxide to make sugar, to make glucose. And that's what the plant uses as its food. That's why this plant doesn't need to eat anything, because it's making its own food, making its own glucose using sunlight. And that happens in the chloroplast. That process is called photosynthesis. When we looked at those pictures of the cells, the reason they look green, all those little green circles in there, those were the chloroplasts. Again, here's another picture. All these little green circles inside of the cell, those are chloroplasts. So any questions about what the organelles do? Tomorrow we'll start to look at what they look like, where they're located, so forth. Good job. I know that's a lot of notes for today, but we got through what I wanted to do.